Are you a scholar, journalist, or writer focused on Palestine? Contribute to the foremost journal on the past, present, and future of Jerusalem. The Jerusalem Quarterly is soliciting articles for peer review, essays, and letters from Jerusalem. Send your work to jq@palestine-studies.org or see palestine-studies.org/journals for more info.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today is with great pleasure my guest is Ramsey Hanhan. Ramsey has come to America from Palestine in his teens, and he had experienced firsthand both the Israeli occupation of Palestine, but also the immigrant journey and rebuilding life anew, like many of the listeners, including myself. Now, in his former career, he was a physics professor, noted for his computer models that describe and predict complexity in nature. I wish he could also predict a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, better say the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Anyway, nowadays you can find him on a jogging trail, deep in the forest, at an airport, or in a coffee shop. All hobbies that I actually share too. Ramsey holds a PhD in engineering from the University of Michigan. However, we're not going to talk about physics nor engineering. In fact, we're going to talk about his new book, Fugitive Dreams, Chronicles of Occupation and Resistance, published by Formind, and it's just been published here in 2022. Ramsey, welcome.
Thank you, Roberto, for inviting me and for reading the book, and also for this wonderful podcast. I watched your last one with Ilan Pape. I learned a lot from listening.
Thank you. Now, the first question I want to ask is, can you tell us a little bit more about your background? I mean, obviously you're an engineer, and I'm curious, how did you write, well, better than how, why did you write a book about Palestine and Chronicle of Resistance?
Well, I was born in Jerusalem in 1973. So back then, the occupation was already there. I was born under occupation. I lived in Ramallah. Around 1990, I came to study in Michigan because the schools there were closed as a result of the Intifada. Maybe we'll talk about that later. Um, so eventually, I ended up becoming a US citizen. But despite that, when I go back to Palestine, I am still subjected to the same restrictions on Palestinians from the West Bank. So you could say that, in a sense, I experienced the occupation my entire life, almost 50 years old. And so back in 2019, just before COVID, I was visiting, and my brother took my 9-year-old daughter and myself on a drive from Ramallah to Nablus. The roads in the West Bank, as you know, are segregated. But this short stretch of roads at the entrance to Nablus was shared by Palestinians and by settlers. And as a result, on the sidewalk, periodically you saw embankments containing Israeli soldiers. Um, and then we passed a few children that were my daughter's age, 9, 10, 11. They were playing with a bicycle. Little further down, you had Israeli soldiers at the military post, and they had their guns trained at the children. Uh, that's a revolting scene that's not new to me. Having grown up there, I had a gun pointed at me twice before I was even 15. And here we are 40 years later, year 2022, and it's still going on. You have, um, soldiers pointing guns at children. And I decided this is it. I got to tell the story. I got to tell the rest of the world what is going on there and how absurd that situation is. Now, you have a question?
Yeah, and I should mention that as we speak right now and we're recording this podcast, there are troubling events occurring in Jerusalem, not certainly promising, given the fact that Israeli authorities have blocked a number of Palestinian neighborhoods, including old refugee camps that have been around for more than 70 years. Uh, and so, yeah, you're right. I mean, these stories are important to be told because, just browsing mainstream media, they may talk about it briefly, but often what they're reporting is very superficial and certainly lacking depth. And more importantly, they always portray only one side of a story and not the other one. And talking
Right.
about story, I really want to ask you about the book itself. Now, this is a work of partial fiction, and I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the process. How did you come up with the idea of a character that we're going to discuss later, um, but also this fictional character is embedded into the story and the history of Palestine and the conflict between Israeli and Palestinians.
Yeah, that's a good question. Originally, the book I started writing in 1993. I was on my first trip back to Palestine after studying in America, and that was also the time of the signing of the Oslo Accords. So there was this promise of peace over there in the Middle East, and I wanted to witness those changes. I wanted to see what's going on. So I took a diary and I started writing every day what I encountered over the summer. And every successive trip, I kept up taking diaries, and those diaries piled up. But I was working full time in science, so I had no time to write a book until my daughter was born in 2010, and I had some free time, and I wanted to write something for her. And I wanted something different. I read a lot of books about Palestine, historical books, political books, and they all miss something. They focus a lot on the death tolls, on the political agreements, on the international law and UN resolutions and stuff like that. But among that, the story that's lost is the story of the ordinary person, the individual, especially children. How does it feel to be born, to grow up, to live under a military occupation? How do you cope? What are the hopes and dreams of the occupied? And when I start thinking like that, fictional, very little is fictional. I'll tell you right off the bat. The names changed. I changed some personal and identifying details. It's partly to protect the identity of others, but it's also because I felt that the personal lives of the characters are of a lesser interest here. In a way, the protagonist is not Samir, but Palestine. Um, what is reality, or what I made sure is as accurate as possible, is the historical events. Most things I describe in the book are actually eyewitness based on my own experiences. Where that's not available, I usually attribute the source. Or Samir read this in Haaretz, or watched it on Al Jazeera, or heard rumors, or so on. The most challenging part to write was the part about the second intifada in chapters 13 and 14, because I was not there to witness it myself. I was in America, and what I have in the book is reconstructed from published eyewitness sources. I try to create some narrative that's authentic, but parts of it are imagined.
You already mentioned the main character, Samir. So I wanted to ask something about him. Uh, let's start with him, right? Who is he? Who is Samir? And to what extent does he represent a Palestinian?
Samir begins life as a little child in Palestine, born in Jerusalem to a Palestinian Christian family. What he learns about Palestine, he learns by observation of everything that's going on around him. He doesn't learn formally about Palestine because the word itself is censored from his school books. So throughout his life, he's just seeking a normal life. He wants to be a kid, he wants to play, he goes to study, etc. He's trying to carry on despite this constant stream of events that are happening and beyond his control. Um, in this sense, Samir could be thought of as any Palestinian, even though he's not average or typical by any means. For example, his family is better off than most financially, but um, I wanted that because it shows that that family wealth doesn't buy much in terms of security or freedom. He's as facing the same dangers and the same restrictions that anyone else in occupied Palestine is facing. Um, his advanced college degree doesn't exempt him from any of that either. He's still treated the same way at the borders and so on.
I'm curious about something more personal. How does Samir relate to your life and experience? Without giving away too much, but I'm really curious to what extent it reflects also your personal life.
Um, let's say that his story is based on my own journey very closely. It's almost an autobiography, but I decided to, the story that's more interesting to me was the story of Palestine through his life, rather than, if I made a book saying, here's the story of Ramsey Hanhan, no one would buy it because I'm unknown. But um, people are interested in Palestine's story. So, in that sense, both Samir and all the other characters in the book are simplified, cartoonish versions, um, where their story is intertwines with the story of Palestine that's highlighted, but other dimensions that have no connection to Palestine are stripped from them. I don't write too much about the science that he was doing or his love affairs or why he got married, why he gets divorced, etc.
Well, I will ask a few things about him. Uh, and I think this is interesting. The fact that you're highlighting how this is a book about Palestine, but also let me say that the book comes out as a book that you can read in two ways. Uh, at least for me, there was also the personal element, perhaps because I work on the history of the region, specifically on Palestine. So I knew the background and I was like thirsty for the kind of human stories. But I also understand that, as you pointed out earlier, that this is a book also providing the background and where Samir is sort of experiencing and living his life. Uh, and so that the readers may also get more information about that. And so I think this is a very important aspect of your book, which I really enjoyed, the fact that you can read it in two different ways. So let me ask something about one of the first chapters of the book. There is an image which I found fascinating because um, several other guests of the podcast who were born, between the 1960s and 70s, they all experienced this kind of, event, driving from somewhere from the West Bank, often from Ramallah, into Jerusalem, and experiencing, the city in different ways, whether it was the Jordanian Jerusalem or the city that being then taken over by Israeli troops after the war of 67. So Samir is driving to Jerusalem. Can you tell us about this experience?
Okay. A slight correction. Samir himself could never drive to Jerusalem. That could never have happened because he left Palestine when he was 16, and the driving age is 18, so he couldn't drive. He would ride with his parents, for example, take their own car. And I write about how occasionally they would encounter a checkpoint, and then the soldiers at the checkpoint had absolute power as far as he's concerned. They could let them go or turn them back or stop them and search the car. And so he had that relationship with those checkpoints even from the time he was very young. By the time he came back from the USA, he had a driver's license, but now the checkpoints had become permanent. And he needed a permit to cross them and go to Jerusalem, even though the city was only 10 miles away from his home in Ramallah. And even if he got that permit, he could not no longer use his own car. He had to rely on public transportation, taxis, shared rides, buses. So, and in fact, more often than not, when he was visiting, he did not have the permit. And so sometimes he traveled to Jerusalem smuggled. And I actually have a poem in the book if you like me to read it.
Please.
Uh, it's called Smuggled. It describes the path of one of those journeys, almost like a treasure map, the secret route that he would take from Ramallah to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, 10 miles south of Ramallah. We first headed north through Birzeit to the deserted Transylvanian Guard Tower. A dirt road from there joined with the Israeli road, taking us east, then south, speeding in between stolen ments, Beth El, Afra, Rimonim. We reached the village of Anata, northeast of Jerusalem. Anathot in the Bible. From Anat, Canaanite goddess of fertility. We ducked before an Israeli checkpoint into the adjacent refugee camp, through a maze of tiny alleys, to the back of the car dealership on the main road, straddling the second checkpoint. I hopped over the fence. The lot attendant offered me Arabic coffee. Thanking him, I sipped while waiting as the car retraced its path through the labyrinth, the Anata checkpoint, and over to pick me up. An hour and a half after leaving Ramallah, I was 10 miles south in the old city of Jerusalem. On its streets, I was wary, tiptoeing through side alleys, avoiding soldiers, one ID check away from 3 nights in an Israeli jail. We walked the old city wall. It was fenced off. The ticketed entrance at Damascus Gate, where soldiers checked IDs. So I climbed the fence at a remote city gate, a thief in my birthplace, or a pirate following a treasure map. Seems all we do in that land is climb over fences to get to places that formerly welcomed everyone, places accessible, unfenced, unwalled.
I must thank you for this because, as- and I'm very much aware that most of the listeners of the podcast are very familiar with the question of checkpoints and the difficulties of crossing borders for Palestinians, particularly traveling from the West Bank, but also the other way around. But there are also as many people that don't really have a sense of how difficult is to travel those 10 miles, those like 15 kilometers. You can catch a bus number 18 from East Jerusalem, and it may take 30 minutes, 1 hour, 1 hour and a half. You never know. And the same is true on the other way around. If you're lucky and you can get a taxi with a license to go across, maybe a little bit easier. But again, there's no real freedom of movement. And this is something that a lot of people don't really, I don't want to say understand in a negative way, but they cannot perceive, like, how is that possible, right? that these two major centers are not really communicating with each other, despite the fact they're only 10 miles apart.
Especially in America, when you can travel so freely to go anywhere, and from here to California or Florida or wherever. Um,
Exactly. Now let me go on and ask a few other questions about
sure.
the book. So Samir is a traveler. He travels certainly around the states, where he's also obviously educated and he lives, and he moved to, but he also goes back to Palestine. And I was wondering, how does this relate to being a Palestinian? This idea of moving, traveling, uh, feeling stateless, asking for documents. How does this relate to sort of a general figure of a Palestinian?
Um, Palestinians and travel are almost married, one would say. If you look at Samir's parents, he's the son of refugees. His parents were among the majority of Palestinians that in 1948 were forced from their homes. And his parents lived along the coast in the cities of Ramle and Jaffa. They're now, occupied within Greater Tel Aviv, enclosed. And but they were forced to leave those homes and go to the hills in the West Bank. That's a story he retells in chapter 4. Now, his parents resettled in Ramallah and started anew, but the conflict followed them. So Israel invaded the West Bank in 1967, started the occupation that is continuing to this day. And 20 years later, Samir is going to school, but the Intifada started. It's a uprising against Israeli rule. And in response, Israel closed the schools and universities in the West Bank. So he was without an education for some time. And as a result, many of his generation, those who could afford it, traveled abroad to complete their education. Some went to Jordan, some went to Europe, the US, Egypt. So by then, 1990s, you have a Palestinian diaspora that spread all over the world. In every country, you could find Palestinians. As a traveler, he's constantly crossing borders, and those borders remind him of this country that he does not have. First time he enters the United States, as you mentioned, he was forced to declare stateless for his nationality. And then at international airports, he could see American and European passport holders whizzing through, but he and other Palestinians are made to wait, sometimes for hours, even in Tel Aviv airport if he's going back home to visit um, his own place. So, and even if he became a U.S. citizen and got an American passport, that does not help him because the American passport would have a place of birth, Jerusalem. I end up calling it the stigma in the book. It's a stigma of being born in Jerusalem. You can't get rid of it. So, like you say, the book covers a lot of journeys, but the one that interests me most, and I discussed that in more detail in the last part of the book, is his own personal journey of growth as a human being. Um,
There is another short story that kind of caught my attention. And I must say that very much because it's related to a teddy bear, one of the favorite of my children and perhaps of your daughter too, Paddington. Um, and and I really feel like I really want to ask Ramsey about it. Can you tell us more about this short story? Why did it make it into the book? What does the story really tell us?
Paddington is the tiny bear that he had as a baby, and somehow he kept it throughout the years. So when Samir decided to stay in America, he was in his mid 20s, and he was had a comfortable job there. So he visiting Palestine in 99, he decides to bring this old bear with him, and it's tattered, it's worn out. So the night before the flight, his mom patches holes in the bear's hands and feet and um, puts it in the suitcase. Well, when he gets to the airport, he gets to go to the Arab room where Palestinians are searched very thoroughly. And the Israeli guard there is alerted at the fresh stitches. She's like, "These stitches are very fresh. We cannot, are you hiding something inside it?" He's like, "No." So, but she insists on undoing those stitches because it's her job to thoroughly search every item in every suitcase that lands in front of her, and she's going by the rule book. He pleads for his bear. It's just an old bear. My mom did this to it yesterday, and he suggested that she takes it to get x-rayed instead. She hesitates. She has a boss to worry about, and she has to follow the rules. But in the end, um, she's convinced. She doesn't undo the stitches. She sends the bear over to get x-rayed. So what's interesting is that he succeeds in connecting with her at a human level, enough to convince her to spare the bear. Originally, I included this story as an example of how ridiculously thorough those border searches are. But it's also the kind of incident that gives me hope. People seeing the humanity of the other side, relating to each other more as individuals than as actors in assigned roles of, border guard and suspect Palestinian. Um,
I found it an amazing story. I saw a lot of sort of different kind of readings, and as you said, there was there is the human side to it, which I sort of I thought about it too. I mean, obviously, as a traveler to Palestine and Israel, many times I've been searched to, mostly because of they can see the publications, and so the connections, the fact that I work for the Jerusalem Quarterly, therefore a Palestinian institution, but obviously it's also true that I never go through the same kind of search and in-depth, sort of scrutiny. So that story caught my attention because it really, I mean, a teddy bear. I don't know. It felt like this is like the extreme, right? And also questioning why it was patched, which also represents, at least to me, this idea of patching someone's identity and life, given all of the travels and the moves and the different sad stories. And the other story I want to ask about is very much about the Intifada. You already mentioned that, this is something that you had to research because you didn't experience it firsthand.
the
And
second
so,
Intifada.
yes, and I wanted to ask
The
you about.
first one is firsthand.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Good. So, let's talk about the first Intifada here first. What was the experience of Samir?
When it started, Samir was a child. His main concerns are riding his bicycle with his friends and, school and school trips and girls. And, he's a 13-year-old, maybe 14. So when the Intifada started, he didn't want to get involved in the uprising. He is cautious. Um, but he observes everything and he watches his brothers and his peers beaten. Some go to prison, some get deported. Schools are closed. So he spends a lot of time at home. He has time to read, but his parents want him to continue his education. And he finds various ways he could get around it. He does some independent study at home. He meets secretly with his classmates against Israeli orders to close the schools. And he's struggling to do this. And then there's this one incident that happens where, he sits down to study, and then his friends, Jawad and Danny, his best buddies, come to ask him to play with them on the bicycle. And having just sat down to study, he says, "No, I'll catch up with you later." And it turns out, because of this split second decision, he escaped the fate that um, befell them. One of them basically ended up being beaten by an Israeli patrol, and the other on the wanted list for pretty much doing nothing. And thinking about that incident, he was terrified because it could have been me. It, whatever happened to his friends, that could have been him. And he started withdrawing, isolating himself, not going outside as much, until his parents decide to send him to the United States, to Michigan, to continue his education.
So he now moves to Michigan. Can you tell us a little bit about his life in America and also his travels back to Palestine? Why did he decide to go back?
Yeah, so by the time he moves to Michigan, he's 16 years old. I would say a 16-year-old adult, because the years of the Intifada made him mature very quickly. And he writes at that portion of his life, he's very interested in contrasting the United States with Palestine, his American friends with his Palestinian friends, trying to find a place for himself to fit in somewhere. But in the back of his mind, he's feeling guilty about leaving his Palestinian friends behind. The way he writes it, I have no scars to bear. He didn't get beaten or end up in jail like many of his friends, and so he carries some guilt for that. Nevertheless, he does well in college. He gets involved in activist groups, um, but ultimately he wants to visit because he misses his country. And 1993 is when the Oslo peace process was starting, and there was a lot of hope, a lot of optimism there, and he was hopeful that he could go back and start a life there, and um, conditions would improve. Eventually, there would be a free Palestinian state within 5 years, as was supposed to happen with Oslo. So he came back to Palestine full of hope. And even though he was visiting frequently in the 90s, and um, he was hopeful that at the end of his studies, he would really resettle back in Palestine.
And I'm curious about the 1990s. I mean, certainly Samir does represent the ideas and the hopes of many Palestinians back then. So, how does he experience those years? And particularly, how did it then uh, react to the fact that at some point it became quite clear that those hopes were not going to turn into reality?
Yeah, this is where his scientist background comes in, because he wants peace just like everyone else, but as a scientist, he's trained to be skeptical. And you see that skepticism in that portion of the book. He's rather critical. He read the agreement himself, so he knows, and he knows the facts, he knows what's going on. When he goes on trips around the West Bank, he sees the settlements, they're as entrenched as ever. Um, Turns on the TV, watches this charade of peace talks and negotiations, but then any short trip outside of Ramallah, he sees borders rising, checkpoints isolating him from Jerusalem, difficulties of travel. So he becomes cynical. He's frustrated both with the proponents of the negotiations because they're dragging their feet so much, but also with the extremists who are actively sabotaging those talks. And extremists, I mean both, Hamas and the Israeli extremists, um, who do what they could, actually almost in league, to try to sabotage this peace process. So early 2000s, he's in America. He's just married, and he's keeping an eye from far away, watching news about what's happening in Palestine. And all he could see is the breakdown of the peace process. Things are not working. No agreement is being reached. And instead, there's fighting that's provoked by Sharon's entry into the mosque. And that started a second intifada. And during that time, he was very tense because he's in USA. He does not get immediate news. He has to rely on the media. And he was highly concerned about the safety of his parents who were still in Palestine and his friends, but at the same time, he could do nothing about it. He is concerned that taxes he pays to the US government are going to fund Israel and give it weapons that are used against his loved ones, but again, he can do nothing about it. And then 911 strikes, September 11 attack on the US, and now you have a whole bunch of complexities opening up. His own fear of further attacks on America, the experience of being a suspect minority, the American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and subsequently, you have a wall rising in Palestine, which makes him even more disillusioned about peace. So you could describe the 2000s as period of disillusionment, growing disillusionment, and destruction of hope. Um, that's a good question because Samir tries his best to see people as individual human beings, regardless of labels. And that's possible. Perhaps, he succeeds because he's in USA where he could meet Israelis and former Israelis in through his work, for example, or through other occasions, and get to know them as people, and they get to know him as, a human being. But the other thing is, he's old enough to remember a time when he knew Israelis by name, friendly ones that did business with his parents and sometimes visited each other. In this is the 70s and the 80s. um, with the checkpoints that came up in the 1990s and now with the wall, he notes that you have a whole generation of Palestinians that grew up having never set foot in Jerusalem. They know Israelis only as soldiers or settlers. And similarly, a whole generation of Israelis know Palestinians only through their military service maintaining that occupation. So, in his mind, that is the problem. Peace involves the lowering of barriers, not the raising them. And so, if we're ever going to have peace, we need to make Israelis and Palestinians talk to each other, not separate them completely. And because that's when you separate people, then you start substituting negative images for the other side, which might have no bearing to reality. And it's this constant contact between people that uh, keeps them in check and keeps their views of the other realistic. Um, I think, his first impression of Americans is that they're highly misinformed about anything outside of America's borders. Few actually have traveled abroad, and few know, world history is not taught as much as American history here. And world events are not covered in the news as much as, local events. So he struggles with that misinformation. Um, and especially the Israeli narrative is more out here in America than the Palestinian narrative. Um, and so, in a sense, that's one of the rationales behind this book, is to try to correct this imbalance, to try to just say what's it like to be growing up in Palestine, and um, just from a human point of view. Um, that's a complex question. I didn't put too many reasons in the book for the divorce. I just say they got divorced, and I think my assessment is that, the divorce would have happened for personal reasons that are unrelated to Palestine. Uh, like Samir says in the book, you cannot blame the Israelis for everything. But at the same time, his life, for a huge number of reasons that are discussed in the first part of the book, he has difficulties relating to women. Part of it is segregation in the schools through middle school. He went to a boys' school. He didn't know how to talk to girls. Uh, the harassments at the borders by Israeli soldiers could have had something to do with it, for all I know. But it becomes shaky to try to draw a causal relationship in something like this. What happened. They divorced, and everybody moved in their own way. This is the vision that I would like to see. Here in America, we have people from many backgrounds and many cultures come together and live together and work together and be productive. And usually it's peaceful. Um, America is becoming more divided, and we all complain about that. But in reality, it's much better situation than what we have in the Middle East, with all those borders and the constant uh, fighting that goes on. And so I dream of a country for all its citizens. Everybody could live as equals, have an equal justice system, live in peace, travel anywhere you want, live anywhere you want, visit any place in Jerusalem that you like. Um, and when I tell that to people, their first reaction is, "Oh, this is too idealistic. This would never happen." And what I say is, we can't allow ourselves to think like that, because if we start thinking that it's never going to happen, then it will never happen. We have to really believe. We have to have hope. And I don't have hope in the governments. The governments are there to maintain their own power. So where I see this coming to fruition is by individual Palestinians and Israelis coming together, making small changes in their lives, growing personally, empowering themselves, leaving victimhood behind, um, and most importantly, talking to each other. Because when we uh, talk to each other, we could solve problems. And there are a lot of common problems besides the conflict. For example, I talk about that a lot in the last part of the book. Look at the land of Palestine, Israel, whatever you might want to call it. The land itself is neglected. It's destroyed by being fought over by the population race. You look at the West Bank now, or even places like Tel Aviv. It's an environmental disaster. You have less trees. Wildlife is fragmented because of the walls and everything else. Water sources are depleted and overtaxed. Construction is sprawled everywhere. Noise, pollutions, hills disfigured. So both people claim they love the land and that's why they're fighting over it. And while they do that, they're destroying the land that they claim they love. Um, that's just a paradox. And what I'm saying is, if we really love the land, let's go fix it. Let's work together. Yeah, definitely. I think, the politics comes and goes, but ultimately what's important is that people have a decent life, decent lives. And the conflict is just making that impossible. And so I made a choice to put people above political concepts. Having a Palestinian state with a flag, well, that's nice, but if it's not going to change reality from what it is, it's not important. Um, I would say probably I cut out about 30% of the first draft of the book. I removed a lot of political parts, and maybe when I was younger, I was more interested in that. But as a father who has a child who wants to see a better future for his child, I don't care about political theories anymore than, just having a reality that is respectful of people's right to live their life in peace. Oh boy. Samir is more at peace with himself. He's writing other books, and he continues to work on himself. As he says in the book, growth is the one process that ought to never end, personal growth. He witnessed the Gaza bombings, of course, in May of last year and in August of this year. But he decided that no addendum is needed because little has changed. Wars on Gaza and the siege, that's in chapter 17. Discontent among Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, chapter 12. Confiscation of Palestinian homes in Sheikh Jarrah, chapter 18. Um, Palestinian education hurdles in Jerusalem, chapter 15. It's all there. And the big question that hasn't changed is, how much longer is this occupation going to continue? Generations were made to suffer it. How many more children, and I'm talking about both Palestinian children and Israeli children, how many more children are going to repeat this story, repeat this cycle? Um, you know, you go on Twitter anytime this week, and there's pictures of Palestinian kids who were killed by Israeli fire, and there's pictures of Israeli soldiers, 18-year-old kids, nevertheless, who were put in uniform and sent to the West Bank to maintain the occupation. And they also got hurt. And it's time to say enough is enough. Let's put a stop to this situation that's unnatural and unhealthy. And we can replace it with something much better where we are all on the same side, working together. Thank you, Roberto. Do I have time for one more brief reading from the book? Thank you. I want to leave you with this passage. This is in 2015 when he goes back to Palestine with his 5-year-old daughter, Ksenia. The closest we got to Jerusalem yet was the hill at Ramallah's outskirt, where I took Ksenia to see it from above the wall. She asked to visit the city. I explained that the Israelis, whom she had encountered at the bridge, blocked us from going there. That night, before bedtime, she approached me, whispering something. I leaned in and asked her to repeat it. She whispered again, with eyes as wide as when I told her about seeing a fox on the trail. Tell me more about the Israelis. I immediately understood the weight of my undertaking. Her attitude toward them will be shaped by mine. Not only what I tell her, but what tone I use and how I behave. Am I angry or fearful? Vengeful, perhaps? Apathetic? Ignorant? I wanted to tell her the truth, but how to stop its bloodied shadow from staining the course of her life? For it is her future that is foremost in my mind. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.